The blizzard came down like God's own fury that January night in 1879, turning the Montana Territory into a white hell that could kill a man in minutes. Wade Garrett was hauling the last armload of split pine to his cabin when he heard it. 3 weak taps against his door, barely audible over the wind's howl. He dropped the wood, ice crystals stinging his face. Nobody with sense traveled in weather like this. The sound came again, weaker now. Wade lifted the heavy bar and cracked open the door. A woman swayed on his threshold, dark hair frozen to her skull, lips blue as winter's sky. In her stiff fingers she clutched a leather satchel and something that glinted in the lamplight, a surveyor's brass compass, its needle spinning wild. "Please," she whispered, the word barely more than breath. "They're stealing everything." She collapsed into his arms as railroad documents scattered across the snow like accusatory ghosts. Wade kicked the door shut against the storm's fury and carried the woman to his stone fireplace. She weighed no more than a sack of grain, her traveling dress stiff with ice. The smell of wet wool and fear filled his small cabin as he laid her on the braided rug before the hearth. "Ma'am?" He knelt beside her, adding split pine to the flames. The fire crackled and hissed, casting dancing shadows on the rough-hewn walls. "Can you hear me?" Her eyes fluttered open, green as spring grass, he noticed, before they closed again. Violent shivers racked her frame. Wade had seen men shake like that after falling through creek ice. Hypothermia could kill as sure as a bullet. "Need to get you warm." He grabbed every quilt from his narrow bed. "Your dress. It's got to come off or you'll catch your death." Her eyes flew open, alarmed. "I'll turn my back," Wade said quickly, his face warming. "There's a clean shirt here. I promise I won't look." She managed the slightest nod. Wade studied the chinking between his logs with intense focus, listening to the rustle of frozen fabric behind him. The wind howled through gaps in the walls, carrying the sharp bite of snow. "I'm decent," came a weak voice. He turned to find her wrapped in his quilts, the collar of his large flannel visible. Color was returning to her cheeks. Wade busied himself ladling stew from the pot that always simmered on his stove, the rich smell of beef and onions warming the air. "Thank you," she whispered as he steadied the tin cup of coffee in her trembling hands. I was sure I'd die out there." "What in blazes were you doing in this storm?" The question came harsher than intended. Fresh tears welled in her eyes. "I had nowhere else to go." Wade handed her the bowl of stew and settled on the floor at a respectful distance. "Eat first, then tell me what happened." As she ate, he noticed her hands, soft, uncalloused city hands. A simple gold band glinted on her left forefinger. When she'd finished, she pulled the quilts tighter around her shoulders. "My name is Clara Morrison," she said, her voice trembling. "I came from Boston as a mail-order bride." The words seemed to cause her physical pain. "I answered an advertisement from Marcus Whitfield. He owns the big spread east of town." Wade knew the name. Whitfield had been buying up land claims faster than a man could file papers, always with railroad money backing him. "He met me at the station this morning," Clara continued. "Took one look at me and said I wasn't what he expected. Too thin, too eastern. Said I'd never survive a Montana winter." Her voice broke. Then he laughed and said he'd ordered a wife, not a parlor ornament. Wade's hands clenched into fists. The fire popped, sending sparks up the chimney. "He brought me as far as the crossroads, then told me to find my own way back to town. When I said I didn't know the way, he tossed my bag in the snow and rode off." She looked up at him, pain bright in her eyes. "The storm came so fast I couldn't see the road anymore. Then I saw your light." "You did right coming here." Wade's voice was a low growl. "Any man who'd leave a woman in weather like this ain't worth spit." Clara fumbled with her satchel, pulling out scattered papers. "He left this too. Said it explained everything." Wade took the documents, squinting at them in the firelight. His blood turned to ice water as he read. The papers weren't just about Clara. They were railroad seizure notices. His own land was marked for acquisition, scheduled for territorial review come spring court session. "Sweet Jesus," he breathed. "These here papers, they're claiming half the valley." Clara's face went white. "What do you mean?" Wade spread the documents on his rough table, the smell of official ink and government seals filling the air. "Look here. Whitfield's filed claims on my spread, the Thompson place, even old Henrick's mining claim up the ridge. Says we're all squatting on railroad right of way. But that's impossible. These homesteads were filed legally. With the territorial office, sure, But according to this, the railroad's got federal backing, says here all claims have to be refiled by spring court session or forfeit to the company. Wade's voice turned grim. That's 4 months away. Clara picked up her father's compass from where it had fallen, its brass surface gleaming in the firelight. The needle swung wildly before settling on true north, pointing directly away from town, toward the high country where the old survey markers stood. My father was a surveyor, she said quietly. Before he died, he used to say the compass never lies. Only men do. Wade stared at the spinning needle, understanding dawning like sunrise. Clara, I reckon we've both been played for fools. The wind gusted hard against the cabin, rattling the windows like skeleton fingers, and Wade couldn't shake the feeling that Marcus Whitfield's reach extended far beyond one abandoned bride. The storm passed by morning, leaving the world buried in silence and snow. Wade woke stiff from sleeping on the hard floor, but Clara was already up, sitting at his table with the documents spread before her. Her traveling dress, now dry but wrinkled beyond repair, made her look like a refugee from some distant catastrophe. Morning, Wade said, working the kinks from his spine. Coffee's still warm. I've been studying these papers, Clara said, without looking up. Something's not right about the dates. Wade poured himself coffee, the bitter smell cutting through the morning air. Outside, snow mounded against the windows like burial shrouds. What kind of not right? These seizure notices are dated 3 weeks ago, but Marcus only placed his advertisement for a bride 2 months back. Clara's finger traced the official seals. Why would he be courting a wife when he knew he was about to steal homestead land? Wade leaned over her shoulder, studying the documents. The paper smelled of government offices and official lies. Maybe he figured having a wife would make his claims look more legitimate, harder to question a family man than a bachelor land grabber. Or maybe, Clara said quietly, he never intended to go through with the marriage at all. The truth hit Wade like a physical blow. You're saying he brought you out here just to abandon you? Make himself look like the wronged party? Think about it. The poor railroad agent betrayed by his eastern bride who ran off with the local rancher. Who would question his motives after that? Wade set down his coffee cup with a sharp clink. That son of a... He caught himself. Pardon my language, ma'am. I've heard worse. Clara gathered the papers into a neat stack. The question is, what do we do about it? The answer came sooner than expected. The sound of approaching horses cut through the morning quiet, harness leather creaking in the cold air. Wade moved to the window and cursed under his breath. 3 riders were making their way up the snowy track, Marcus Whitfield's bulky frame unmistakable even at a distance, flanked by Sheriff Burns and one of Whitfield's hired men. Company, Wade said grimly. Stay inside. Clara appeared beside him at the window, her face draining of color. It's him. I'll handle this. Wade checked his Colt, then stepped onto the porch. The cold air bit at his face, carrying the smell of horse sweat and trouble. Whitfield reined in his mount a few yards from the cabin, his heavy features set in what he probably thought was righteous anger. Sheriff Burns looked uncomfortable, shifting in his saddle like a man who'd rather be anywhere else. Garrett, Whitfield called, his breath steaming in the frigid air. I believe you've got something of mine. Don't see any property of yours here, Wade replied evenly. The woman, my bride. She's mine by legal contract. Wade felt his jaw tighten. I reckon the lady can speak for herself. Clara stepped onto the porch behind him, chin held high despite her trembling hands. I'm no man's property, Mr. Whitfield. You made that clear when you abandoned me in a blizzard. Whitfield's face darkened like a storm cloud. Now see here, girl. We had an agreement, legal and binding. I paid your passage. You also dissolved that agreement, Clara shot back, her voice steady. In writing. I have your letter. That was a misunderstanding. Heat of the moment. Whitfield's horse stamped impatiently, sensing its rider's agitation. I've reconsidered. Wade let out a harsh laugh. Reconsidered? After leaving her to freeze to death? Sheriff Burns finally spoke up, his voice carrying the weight of reluctant duty. Folks, let's keep this civil. Mr. Whitfield says Miss Morrison is his legal bride. Says you two need to sort this out proper-like. There's nothing to sort out, Clara said firmly. Mr. Whitfield rejected me, abandoned me, and severed our agreement in writing. I owe him nothing. You owe me $300, Whitfield snarled, dropping all pretense of civility. Cost of your passage and arrangements. You'll work it off one way or another. The threat in his voice made Wade step forward, his hand drifting toward his gun. That's enough, Whitfield. The lady said she's not going with you. That's the end of it. This ain't your business, Garrett. Stand aside. I'm making it my business. The two men stared each other down, tension crackling between them like electricity before a lightning strike. Sheriff Burns dismounted, holding his hands up peacefully. Let's discuss this civilized-like, he said. Miss Morrison, do you have this letter Mr. Whitfield mentioned? Clara disappeared inside, returning with the crumpled paper. Burns read it slowly, his eyebrows rising. Seems pretty clear, Marcus. Says right here you're dissolving the agreement. Even included money for return passage. I was hasty, Whitfield growled. A man can change his mind. Not after abandoning a woman in a blizzard, Burns replied sharply. That's attempted murder in some folks' books. I told her the way to town, Whitfield protested. In a storm, with night coming on, Wade interjected. 5 miles through country she'd never seen. She'd have died if she hadn't found my place. Burns looked at Clara. Miss Morrison, what do you want to do? Law's murky here, but I'm inclined to side with you given the circumstances. I want nothing more to do with Mr. Whitfield, Clara said clearly. I consider our business concluded. Whitfield spurred his horse forward, rage twisting his features. You think you can keep her, Garrett? A worthless homesteader playing hero? He leaned forward in his saddle, his voice dropping to a venomous whisper. When I'm done with you, you won't have pot to piss in or a window to throw it out of. Wade's hand found his gun grip. You threatening me, Whitfield? Just stating facts. Whitfield straightened, his smile cold as January wind. See, I've been talking to folks in town. Seems there's questions about your homestead claim, questions about whether you're really entitled to this land. The sheriff frowned. What kind of questions? The kind that gets settled in territorial court, Whitfield said, his voice dripping with satisfaction. Come spring session, we'll see who really owns what around here. He wheeled his horse around, calling over his shoulder. Enjoy your winter, Garrett. Might be your last one here. As the three riders disappeared into the snow, Wade felt the ground shifting beneath his feet like river ice in a spring thaw. The next morning brought news that changed everything. Wade was splitting firewood behind the cabin when he heard the distinctive clicking of telegraph keys drifting from the direction of town. The sound carried clear in the thin mountain air, urgent and insistent. Someone's working that telegraph mighty hard, Clara observed from the doorway, wrapping one of his coats around her shoulders against the bite of winter wind. Wade buried his axe in the chopping block. Might be worth a ride to town, see what's got folks so stirred up. The telegraph office sat at the end of Stone Creek's main street, a narrow building that smelled of electrical current and Rose Chin's ever-present pot of tea. Rose looked up as Wade entered, her dark eyes bright with intelligence and something else, excitement maybe, or fear. Wade Garrett, she said, glancing around to make sure they were alone. I was hoping you'd come by. Heard you've been busy on the keys. Rose's fingers drummed nervously on her desk. The scent of jasmine tea couldn't quite mask the acrid smell of burning wire from the telegraph equipment. Messages coming in all morning, about land claims, survey disputes, railroad acquisitions. She lowered her voice. About you and that woman you're harboring. Wade felt his jaw tighten. What kind of messages? The kind that make a person wonder if all this land trouble started before you found Miss Morrison in that blizzard. Rose pulled out a leather folder, thick with transcribed telegraph messages. I've been keeping copies. Probably shouldn't, but something about this whole business doesn't sit right. She opened the folder, revealing page after page of messages in her neat handwriting. The paper rustled like dry leaves as she sorted through them. Look here. 3 weeks ago, Marcus Whitfield sent this to the railroad office in Helena. She handed him a transcription. Land acquisition proceeding on schedule. Homestead challenges filed. Expect territorial review, spring session. Resistance minimal. Wade studied the message, his blood growing cold. This was sent before Clara even arrived. Gets better. Rose pulled out another sheet. 2 days later, he sent this to a law firm in Billings. Require legal representation, territorial court, multiple homestead disputes, substantial railroad compensation authorized. The implications hit Wade like a physical blow. He's been planning this for weeks. Clara was just window dressing. Or worse, Rose's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. Yesterday, I intercepted something meant for the sheriff. Whitfield's requesting a federal marshal to investigate squatter claims and immoral cohabitation. Wade's hand drifted to his gun. He's trying to paint us as criminals. That's not all. Rose reached into her desk drawer and pulled out a small brass key. This came with a message from Judge Samuel Cross in Helena. He's coming early for territorial court. Next week, not spring. The room seemed to spin around Wade. An early court session meant no time to prepare, no time to gather evidence or find legal representation. Why would the judge come early? According to his message, there's been complaints about irregular land transactions in this district. Someone's been filing false claims. Rose's eyes met his. Problem is, if Whitfield gets to him first... Wade understood. The first story the judge heard would carry weight, especially if it came from a man with railroad money and legal counsel. What about Clara? Does she know about this? Not yet. But Wade, there's something else. Rose pulled out one more message, this one shorter than the rest. This came in an hour ago, from the Boston Herald newspaper. Wade read the transcription, his heart sinking with each word. Seeking information Clara Morrison, missing person, substantial reward offered. Contact Whitfield Associates, Stone Creek, Montana Territory. He's making her look like a runaway, Wade said, his voice hollow. Or worse. A woman who abandoned her legal obligations and seduced an honest rancher into harboring her. Rose's voice was bitter. By the time Judge Cross gets here, half the territory will think you're both criminals. The telegraph key suddenly chattered to life, making them both jump. Rose moved quickly to transcribe the incoming message, her face growing pale as she wrote. What is it? Wade asked. Judge Cross, he's arriving tomorrow morning on the stage, wants to meet with all parties involved in the Stone Creek land disputes by noon. Rose looked up at him, fear bright in her eyes. Wade, if you don't have evidence to back up your claims... I know. Wade took the messages, folding them carefully. Rose, why are you helping us? This could cost you your job. Rose was quiet for a long moment, the smell of jasmine and electrical current thick in the air. Outside, the wind rattled the windows like impatient fingers. My family came here from California when I was 12, she said finally. We filed a homestead claim fair and square, worked that land with our own hands. Then one day, men with lawyers and federal papers showed up and said we were squatters, said we had to pay rent to some company back east or get off our own land. Her voice hardened. My father fought it, took what little money we had and hired a lawyer. Case dragged on for 2 years while the legal fees ate us alive. In the end, we lost everything. Father died of a heart attack 3 days after they evicted us. Wade felt the weight of her story settle over him like a heavy coat. I'm sorry. What I'm saying is, I know what it looks like when honest folks get crushed by men with more money than conscience. Rose stood, her small frame radiating determination. You and Miss Morrison deserve better than that. Wade pocketed the messages, his mind racing. If Judge Cross is coming tomorrow, we need proof. Real evidence, not just telegraph messages. What kind of proof? Wade remembered Clara's compass, how it had pointed toward the high country where the old survey markers stood. The kind that's been buried under snow all winter, the kind that proves who really owns what around here. He turned toward the door, then paused. Rose, keep monitoring those telegraph lines. If anything else comes through, I'll find you. She was already turning back to her equipment, fingers poised over the keys. Wade stepped into the cold mountain air, the taste of winter and trouble sharp on his tongue. Time was running out, and Judge Cross would be here by morning. Judge Samuel Cross arrived on the morning stage like an Old Testament prophet, his black coat dusted with road grime and his steel-gray beard crackling with authority. Wade watched from the general store window as the judge stepped down onto the muddy boardwalk, his keen eyes taking in every detail of Stone Creek's main street. There's your law, muttered Henrik Olsen, the old Norwegian who ran the hardware store. Question is, whose law he's carrying? Wade felt the weight of stares as he moved through the store. Word had spread fast about his arrangement with Clara Morrison, and the whispers followed him like smoke. The smell of leather goods and gun oil couldn't mask the stench of disapproval hanging in the air. Wade Garrett? Judge Cross's voice cut through the morning bustle. The man stood in the doorway, his presence filling the space like weather. I'd like a word. Every conversation in the store died. Wade felt dozens of eyes on him as he followed the judge outside. The wooden boardwalk creaked under their boots, and somewhere a dog barked with nervous energy. "I understand you're harboring a woman of questionable reputation," Cross said, without preamble. His breath steamed in the cold air, mixing with the acrid smell of wood smoke from the nearby chimneys. "I'm providing shelter to a woman who was abandoned in a blizzard," Wade replied carefully. "Nothing questionable about Christian charity." Cross's gray eyes studied him like a hawk evaluating prey. "Mr. Whitfield tells a different story, says she's his legal bride who ran off with promises of your protection." Wade felt his jaw clench. "Whitfield's a liar." Strong words. Cross pulled out a leather portfolio, thick with official papers, especially when he's got documentation to back his claims. Marriage contract, paid passage receipts, witness statements from the train conductor about Miss Morrison's destination. The papers rustled in the mountain wind like dead leaves. Wade's heart sank as he realized how thoroughly Whitfield had prepared his deception. "What witness statements?" Wade asked. "Conductor says Miss Morrison spoke often about her intended husband during the journey, how excited she was to start her new life, how grateful she was for his generosity." Cross's voice was flat, professional. "Doesn't sound like a woman planning to abandon her obligations." "Because she wasn't. Whitfield threw her out when she didn't meet his expectations." "So you say, but Mr. Whitfield has 3 men willing to swear they saw you meeting secretly with Miss Morrison before her supposed abandonment. Says you've been planning this deception for weeks." Wade felt the ground shifting beneath his feet. "That's impossible. I never met Clara before that night." "Clara, is it?" Cross made a note in his portfolio. "Awfully familiar for a chance encounter." Before Wade could respond, a commotion erupted from the direction of the bank. Raised voices carried across the street, and Wade recognized one of them with a sinking heart, Clara's voice, sharp with anger and fear. They hurried toward the disturbance, finding a crowd gathered outside Merchants and Farmers Bank. Clara stood on the wooden steps, her traveling dress wrinkled but her spine straight as a rifle barrel. Facing her was bank president Theodore Morrison, no relation, despite the shared name, flanked by Marcus Whitfield and 2 men Wade didn't recognize. "Miss Morrison," Morrison was saying, his voice carrying the oily authority of money, "I'm afraid your account has been frozen pending resolution of certain legal matters." "What account?" Clara's voice rang with indignation. "I don't have an account at your bank." "The account established by your fiancé for your settlement expenses," Whitfield interjected smoothly. $300, as agreed in our marriage contract. Unfortunately, given your breach of agreement, those funds must be returned to their rightful owner." Wade pushed through the crowd, Judge Cross close behind. The smell of fear and anger hung thick in the air, mixing with the scent of pine tar from the bank's freshly painted walls. "Clara," Wade said quietly, "what's happening here?" "They're claiming I stole money that never existed," she replied, her green eyes bright with fury. "Mr. Whitfield says he deposited my settlement funds here, but I never signed any papers, never had access to any account." Whitfield stepped forward, his bulk imposing in the narrow space. "The law is clear on this matter, Judge Cross. A woman who abandons her marriage obligations forfeits any financial settlements. I'm simply reclaiming what's mine." Cross studied the papers Whitfield offered. These documents appear to be in order. Account established 2 weeks before Miss Morrison's arrival, funded by cashier's check from the Montana and Pacific Railroad. "Railroad money," Wade said, understanding flooding through him. "This whole thing's been a setup from the start." "Careful, Garrett," Whitfield warned. "Making accusations you can't prove could be considered slander." "I can prove plenty," Wade shot back, reaching for the telegraph messages Rose had given him. But his pocket was empty. The papers were gone. Whitfield's smile was cold as winter wind. "Looking for something. I found these interesting documents in the telegraph office this morning. Seems Miss Chen has been intercepting private communications. That's a federal offense." Wade's blood turned to ice. "Where is she?" "Under arrest," said a new voice. Sheriff Burns pushed through the crowd, his face grim. "Tampering with federal communications, conspiracy to defraud, aiding and abetting known criminals." "Rose isn't a criminal," Clara said fiercely. "That'll be for the territorial court to decide," Judge Cross said. He looked at Wade with disappointment that cut deeper than anger. "Mr. Garrett, in light of these new developments, I'm afraid I have to question your version of events." "What new developments?" Wade demanded. Cross consulted his portfolio. Bank records show you've been borrowing heavily against your homestead. Feed loans, equipment purchases, emergency funds for winter supplies. According to these documents, you owe over $800, more than twice your land's assessed value. The crowd murmured, and Wade felt their judgment like physical weight. He'd taken those loans to keep his cattle alive through harsh winters, but now they looked like the desperate acts of a man facing ruin. Furthermore, Cross continued, these telegraph messages suggest you and Miss Chen have been plotting to discredit Mr. Whitfield's legitimate business interests. Industrial sabotage is a serious crime in territorial jurisdiction. Wade looked around at the faces surrounding him, neighbors he'd known for years, now staring at him like he was a stranger. The smell of wood smoke and winter air seemed suddenly suffocating. Judge, Clara said, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands, I can prove Mr. Whitfield is lying. How? She reached into her coat and pulled out her father's brass compass. The needle pointed steadily north toward the high country where survey markers lay buried under snow. My father surveyed this territory 15 years ago. His records show who really owns what land around here. Whitfield's face went pale. That compass proves nothing. Old surveys were superseded by railroad claims. Were they? Clara's green eyes blazed with determination. Because, according to federal law, the first filed claim takes precedence, and my father's survey was registered in Washington before the railroad ever saw this valley. Judge Cross leaned forward, suddenly interested. Do you have documentation of this survey? I know where the original markers are buried. The silence stretched taut as a bowstring. Then Whitfield laughed, harsh and bitter. Convenient story, Miss Morrison, but even if such markers existed, they'd be under 6 feet of snow until spring thaw. This court can't wait for imaginary evidence. Wade felt the trap closing around them like the jaws of a steel snare. That evening, Wade sat alone in his cabin, staring into the fire's dying embers. The smell of cold ash and defeat hung heavy in the air. Clara had retired to his bed hours ago, but he could hear her quiet weeping through the thin wall that separated them. The sound cut him deeper than any blade. A soft knock interrupted his brooding. Wade opened the door to find Doc Henley standing on his porch, the old physician's medical bag clutched in his gnarled hands. Behind him, lamplight from town flickered like distant stars. Evening, Wade, Doc said, stamping snow from his boots. Mind if I come in? Got something needs discussing. Wade stepped aside, grateful for any company that didn't come with handcuffs or legal papers. Doc Henley had delivered half the babies in Stone Creek and buried the other half's grandparents. If anyone could be trusted, it was him. Heard about the troubles, Doc said, settling into Wade's only chair. The leather creaked under his weight, and the scent of carbolic acid that always clung to him mixed with the cabin's wood smoke. Thought you might need a friend. Friends seem to be in short supply these days, Wade replied, pouring coffee that had been brewing since morning. The bitter smell couldn't mask the taste of his own despair. That's where you're wrong, son. Doc accepted the cup with steady hands. There's more folks in town questioning Whitfield's story than you might think. Old Henrik's been asking pointed questions about those railroad papers. Mrs. Patterson at the boarding house says something smells fishy about the whole business. Wade felt a flicker of hope, quickly suppressed. Won't matter if Judge Cross has already made up his mind. Judges can change their minds when presented with new evidence, Doc said carefully. Question is, do you have any? Before Wade could answer, Clara appeared in the doorway, wrapped in one of his quilts. Her eyes were red from crying, but her jaw was set with determination. I've been thinking about what my father used to say, she said, moving to join them by the fire. About how the compass never lies, only men do. Doc Henley studied her with the same intensity he brought to diagnosing illness. Your father was a surveyor, I hear. The best in New England, Clara said with quiet pride. He taught me to read topographical maps before I could read scripture. Said the land tells its own truth if you know how to listen. She pulled her father's compass from her coat pocket, its brass surface gleaming in the firelight. The needle swung briefly before settling on true north. This compass has something Whitfield's forged papers don't, she continued. It knows where the original survey markers are buried. Wade leaned forward. But they're under 6 feet of snow until spring thaw. Not all of them. Clara's green eyes brightened with sudden understanding. Father always placed his primary markers on high ground, where wind keeps the snow thin, and he used iron stakes driven deep into bedrock. they'd still be there after 15 years. Doc Henley set down his coffee cup with a sharp clink. You're talking about going up into the high country in winter. That's dangerous territory even in good weather. Less dangerous than letting Whitfield steal half the valley, Wade said, understanding dawning. Clara, if we could find even one of those markers, we could prove the original survey boundaries, show that Father's claims predate any railroad acquisition by years. She clutched the compass tighter. But we'd have to move fast, before Judge Cross makes his final ruling. Wade was already reaching for his coat. How long to reach the high markers? In this snow, 6 hours up, 4 back down if we push hard. Clara studied the compass needle. We'd have to leave before dawn to make it back by evening. In weather like this, that's a fool's errand, Doc warned. One wrong step, one hidden crevice, and they'll find your bodies come spring. Wade paused, his hand on the door latch. The old physician was right. It was dangerous beyond measure. But as he looked at Clara's determined face, he realized some things were worth the risk. Doc, what would you do if someone was trying to steal everything you'd worked for? Henley was quiet for a long moment, the fire crackling in the silence. I'd fight, he said finally, but I'd fight smart. Then help us fight smart, Clara said. We need someone we trust to know where we're going, someone who can tell our story if... She didn't finish the sentence, but they all understood. The high country in winter was unforgiving. Many who went up didn't come back down. Doc Henley sighed, the sound heavy with resignation and resolve. What do you need me to do? Be our witness, Wade said. If we don't make it back, make sure folks know the truth about Whitfield's scheme. The old man nodded slowly. And if you do make it back? Clara held up the compass, its needle pointing steadily toward the mountains. Then we'll have proof that some things can't be bought, forged, or stolen. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the windows like an impatient ghost. Tomorrow would bring either vindication or death, and Wade found himself strangely at peace with either outcome. Some fights were worth having, regardless of the cost. They left before dawn, when the world was still locked in winter's grip, and the only sound was the crunch of snowshoes on frozen ground. Wade led the way, following game trails that switchbacked up the mountainside toward the high country. Behind him, Clara moved with surprising grace for a city woman, her father's compass clutched in her mittened hand. The climb took them through stands of pine and aspen, the trees creaking in the wind like old bones. The smell of snow and pine resin filled the thin air, sharp and clean after the close confines of the valley. Wade's breath steamed as he broke trail, his muscles warming to the familiar rhythm of mountain travel. How much farther? Clara called, her voice muffled by the scarf wrapped around her face. Wade consulted his pocket watch. Another hour to the ridgeline. That's where your father would have placed his primary markers. They climbed in silence after that, saving their breath for the steep ascent. The sun climbed with them, turning the snow from blue to gold to blinding white. At tree line, the wind hit them with full force, carrying the bite of altitude and the promise of weather. There, Clara said suddenly, pointing with the compass. Father always said to look for the highest point with a clear view in all directions. Wade shaded his eyes against the glare. A rocky outcrop thrust up from the snow about 100 yards ahead, its southern face swept clean by the constant wind. It was exactly the kind of spot a surveyor would choose for a primary marker. They reached the outcrop as the sun hit its zenith. Clara knelt in the snow, brushing away the loose powder with her hands. The compass needle pointed steadily north, its brass face gleaming in the mountain light. Here, she said, excitement cutting through the cold. The marker should be right here. Wade pulled out his camp shovel and began digging. The snow was deeper than expected, packed hard by weeks of wind. His shoulders burned as he worked, the metal blade ringing against stone and ice. 3 feet down, the shovel struck something solid with a metallic clang. Found it, Wade breathed, his words forming clouds in the frigid air. Together, they cleared away the remaining snow, revealing an iron stake driven deep into the bedrock. Attached to it was a brass plate, green with age but still legible. Clara traced the engraved letters with her finger, tears freezing on her cheeks. Morrison Survey, 1864, Primary Marker 7, Territorial Grant 447B. Wade felt his heart hammering with more than exertion. This proves your father's survey was filed 15 years before Whitfield's railroad claims. Clara was already consulting a map from her father's old surveying kit, comparing compass bearings to the markings on the brass plate. According to this, Marker 7 establishes the eastern boundary of your homestead and 2 others. Everything from here to Willow Creek belongs to the original claimants, including your father's land grant, 460 acres that Whitfield's been trying to steal. Clara's voice hardened. We need to get back to town. Judge Cross needs to see this. They were packing up their gear when Wade heard it, the distant sound of horses climbing the mountain trail. He grabbed his rifle, squinting down at the switchbacks below. Company, he said grimly. 3 riders were making their way up the trail, still an hour below but climbing fast. Even at this distance, Wade recognized Marcus Whitfield's bulky frame. How did they know we were here? Clara whispered. Wade cursed himself for a fool. Doc Henley, someone must have been watching his place, saw us talking. Or maybe Doc isn't the ally we thought he was, Clara said, her voice bitter with betrayal. The riders were climbing faster now, pushing their horses hard despite the treacherous footing. Wade could see the glint of metal, rifles or pistols, impossible to tell at this distance. We need to move, Wade said, shouldering his pack. They've got horses, we've got snowshoes and a head start. They began their descent on the far side of the ridge, away from the approaching riders. The snow was deeper here, protected from the wind, and their snowshoes sank with each step. Behind them, the sound of pursuit grew louder. Wade, Clara called, her voice tight with fear. The compass, it's pointing toward another marker. Wade looked where she indicated. A quarter mile to the west, another rocky outcrop thrust up from the snow. If there was a second marker there, it would establish the northern boundary of the disputed territory. 2 markers are better than 1, Wade said, changing direction. They reached the second outcrop as the sound of horses grew dangerously close. This marker was easier to find, the iron stake protruding slightly above the snow line. Clara quickly copied the coordinates and bearing information while Wade kept watch. Marker 4, she announced. This confirms the boundaries father established. Whitfield's claims overlap with legitimately filed homesteads by more than 1,000 acres. A rifle shot cracked across the mountainside, the bullet whining off the rocks above their heads. Whitfield and his men had reached the ridgeline. Time to go, Wade said, grabbing Clara's hand. They plunged down the mountainside, their snowshoes throwing up clouds of powder. Behind them, more shots echoed across the peaks, but the distance was too great for accurate shooting. The descent became a controlled fall, Wade using his rifle as a balance pole while Clara clutched her father's survey materials. The trees rushed up to meet them, offering cover from the rifle fire above. The trail, Clara gasped, pointing through the pines. If we can reach the main trail before they do. Wade saw her plan. The main trail switched back down the mountain face, but there was a steep couloir that dropped straight toward the valley floor. Dangerous in the extreme, but it would cut their descent time in half. That's a hellish steep slide, Wade warned. Better than a bullet in the back, Clara replied, her green eyes bright with determination. They reached the edge of the couloir as the sound of pursuit grew closer. Below them, the mountainside dropped away like a frozen waterfall, steep enough to break bones, but maybe, just maybe, navigable on snowshoes. Wade looked at Clara, seeing his own fear reflected in her face. But beneath the fear was something else, a fierce resolve that reminded him why he'd fallen in love with her courage. Trust me? He asked. She gripped his hand tighter. With my life. The slide down the couloir nearly killed them both. Wade went first, using his rifle as a brake while his snowshoes carved twin furrows in the steep snow. Behind him, Clara followed in his tracks, her father's survey materials clutched against her chest like precious cargo. The world became a blur of white and speed, pine branches whipping past their faces as they rocketed toward the valley floor. They hit the bottom in a tangle of limbs and equipment rolling to a stop against a fallen log. Wade tasted blood and soya, his ribs screaming from the impact. Beside him, Clara groaned and struggled to sit up, her dark hair wild with snow and pine needles. The papers, she gasped, frantically checking her coat. Did they survive? Wade helped her inventory the survey materials. Her father's compass was intact, its brass face unmarked despite the violent descent. The coordinate notes were soggy but readable, and most importantly, the rubbings from the brass marker plates were undamaged. We've got what we need, Wade said, though his voice carried more hope than certainty. The sound of pursuit had faded, but Wade knew Whitfield would find another way down. They had maybe an hour's head start, no more. They limped through the forest toward town, following deer trails and creek beds to avoid the main roads. The afternoon sun slanted through the pines, casting long shadows that seemed to reach for them like grasping fingers. Wade's injured ribs made breathing painful, and Clara favored her left ankle where she'd twisted it in the fall. Wade, Clara said as they paused to rest beside a frozen stream, What if this doesn't work? What if Judge Cross doesn't believe the evidence? Wade had been asking himself the same question for the past hour. The markers proved the original survey boundaries, but would that be enough to overcome Whitfield's money and political connections? Then we'll have done everything we could, he said finally. Sometimes that's all a man can do. Clara was quiet for a long moment, her breath steaming in the cold air. In Boston, I used to think right and wrong were simple things. Good people did good things, bad people got punished, and justice always won in the end. What changed your mind? Coming west, seeing how money talks louder than truth out here. She touched her father's compass, its needle pointing steadily north. Maybe we're fools for thinking we can beat Whitfield at his own game. Wade felt the weight of doubt settling over him like a heavy coat. Clara was right. They were two people with nothing but truth on their side, going up against a man with unlimited resources and the law in his pocket. My father used to say something, Wade said slowly. He said a man's got two choices when trouble comes calling. He can stand up and fight, or he can crawl away and spend the rest of his life wondering what might have been. And which choice did your father make? Wade's jaw tightened with old pain. He crawled away, lost our farm to a banker who was cheating on the interest rates. Father knew it, could have proved it, but he was scared of making trouble. He met Clara's eyes. He died 5 years later, still talking about what he should have done different. They resumed walking, their snowshoes crunching through the frozen crust. The smell of wood smoke drifted from the direction of town, carrying with it the sense of civilization and safety. So you're fighting for him too, Clara said. It wasn't a question. Maybe. Or maybe I'm just fighting because it's the right thing to do. They reached the outskirts of Stone Creek as the sun touched the western peaks. Lamplight glowed in windows, and the sound of ordinary life, dogs barking, children calling, the ring of hammer on anvil, filled the evening air. But something was wrong. Too many people were gathered in the street, their voices carrying the sharp edge of excitement and fear. Wade and Clara approached cautiously, staying in the shadows between buildings. "What's happening?" Clara whispered. Wade caught fragments of conversation from the crowd. "Found her in the telegraph office. Stealing federal communications. Crimes against the territory." His blood went cold. "Rose. They've got Rose." They worked their way closer, using the crowd for cover. In front of the jailhouse, Sheriff Burns stood with Judge Cross and Marcus Whitfield. Between them, in iron shackles, stood Rose Chen. Her dark hair was disheveled, and her usually neat dress was torn and dirty. "Serious charges," Judge Cross was saying, his voice carrying clearly in the cold air. "Tampering with federal communications, conspiracy to defraud the territorial government, aiding known criminals in acts of sedition." "Your Honor," Rose said, her voice steady despite her obvious fear, "I was only trying to expose corruption. Those messages prove you've been intercepting private communications." Whitfield interrupted. "A federal crime punishable by 10 years in territorial prison." Wade felt Clara's hand grip his arm. "We have to help her." "How?" "If we show ourselves now, they'll arrest us too." "But she's innocent. She was helping us gather evidence." "Evidence of what?" Wade's voice was bitter. "2 iron stakes in the snow, coordinates that could be from anywhere. Without Rose's telegraph messages, we've got nothing but our word against Whitfield's lawyers." Clara stared at him, her green eyes wide with disbelief. "You're giving up? After everything we've been through?" Wade looked at the crowd, at the judge's stern face, at Whitfield's satisfied smile. The weight of reality crushed down on him like an avalanche. "I'm being practical. Rose is going to prison, whether we help her or not. If we try to intervene now, we'll just be joining her in a cell." "So we let her take the blame for our fight?" Wade had no answer. In the distance, Rose was being led into the jailhouse, her head held high despite the chains around her wrists. The crowd began to disperse, their entertainment over. Clara turned away from him, her face hard as winter stone. "My father used to say the compass never lies. Only men do. I thought you were different, Wade. I thought you were the kind of man who'd stand up when it mattered." The accusation hit him like a physical blow. "Clara, you don't understand." "I understand perfectly." Her voice was quiet, deadly. "When the choice came between doing right and staying safe, you chose safety, just like your father did." She walked away into the darkness, leaving Wade alone with his shame and the bitter taste of cowardice in his mouth. Wade stood alone in the street for a long time. After Clara disappeared into the darkness, her words echoing in his mind like accusations. The crowd had dispersed, leaving only the smell of wood smoke and the distant sound of Rose's cell door clanging shut. His breath steamed in the cold air, each exhalation a visible reminder of his shame. Just like your father did. The truth of it cut deeper than any blade. When the moment came to choose between safety and righteousness, he'd chosen the coward's path. But as he stood there in the gathering darkness, something else stirred in his chest. Anger. Not at Clara or Rose or even Whitfield, but at himself. Wade Garrett had spent his whole life trying not to be his father, and in one crucial moment he'd become exactly what he'd sworn never to be. "Well," he said aloud to the empty street, his voice rough with resolve, "reckon it ain't too late to fix that." He found Clara at Doc Henley's clinic, sitting beside the old physician's examination table while he tended to her twisted ankle. The smell of carbolic acid and medicinal herbs filled the small room, mixing with the scent of Clara's fear and disappointment. "How's the ankle?" Wade asked from the doorway. Clara didn't look up. "It'll heal, unlike some things." Doc Henley glanced between them, his weathered face creased with concern. "You two need to talk, and you need to do it quick before Whitfield consolidates his position." Wade stepped into the room, his hat in his hands. "Clara, I was wrong. Dead wrong." "Were you?" Her green eyes finally met his, cold as winter sky. "Or were you just being practical?" "I was being a coward," Wade said simply. "Just like my father. But I'm done with that now." He pulled her father's survey materials from his coat, spreading them on Doc Henley's table. The brass compass caught the lamplight, its needle pointing steadily north toward truth and justice. "We've got proof of Whitfield's fraud. Real proof, not just telegraph messages he can dismiss as forgeries." Wade's voice grew stronger with each word. "Question is, are you willing to fight alongside a man who let you down when it mattered most?" Clara studied his face for a long moment, searching for something. Sincerity, perhaps, or the kind of courage that didn't falter when tested. "What changed your mind?" she asked quietly. "You did, and Rose, and the memory of my father dying with regrets." Wade met her eyes steadily. "I'd rather face Whitfield's bullets than spend the rest of my life knowing I could have made a difference and chose not to." Doc Henley finished wrapping Clara's ankle, his movements efficient despite his age. "If you're planning what I think you're planning, you'll need more than just survey coordinates." "What do you mean?" Clara asked. "I mean, Whitfield's got Judge Cross convinced that you're both criminals. You need to change that narrative before you present any evidence." The old physician moved to his medicine cabinet, pulling out a small leather journal. "Might be this could help." Wade opened the journal, his eyes widening as he read. Page after page of careful notations, dates, times, conversations overheard in the clinic waiting room. Whitfield's men discussing land acquisitions, railroad payments, forged documents. "You've been keeping records," Wade breathed. 20 years of doctoring teaches a man to pay attention to details, and lately there's been a lot of interesting details to notice. Doc Henley's eyes twinkled with something that might have been mischief. "Amazing what folks will say when they think you're just a harmless old sawbones." Clara leaned forward, reading over Wade's shoulder. "This entry from 3 weeks ago, Whitfield discussing payment schedules for false testimony. This one. Railroad advance payment for territorial acquisitions not yet legally completed. Evidence of conspiracy," Wade said, understanding dawning. "Doc, why didn't you speak up before?" "Because one old man's word against Whitfield's money wouldn't have mattered, but one old man's documented observations combined with physical proof from the mountain markers." Doc Henley smiled. "That might be enough to make Judge Cross listen." Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the clinic windows like impatient fingers. The sound reminded Wade that time was running short. Judge Cross would render his decision by morning. "There's something else," Clara said, consulting her father's compass. "The coordinates from the mountain markers don't just prove the original survey boundaries, they prove Whitfield filed fraudulent claims on land he knew was already legally owned." Wade studied the survey notes, his understanding of the implications growing. That's not just civil fraud. That's criminal conspiracy to defraud the territorial government. Federal charges, Doc Henley added with satisfaction. The kind that carry serious prison time. A plan began forming in Wade's mind. Dangerous but possible. Judge Cross is staying at the hotel tonight. If we could present all this evidence together, the survey markers, your journal, the proof of fraudulent filings, you'd still have to overcome Whitfield's bought testimony, Clara pointed out. Not if we present it publicly, Wade said. Tomorrow morning, when court convenes, half the town will be there. If we can expose Whitfield's lies in front of everyone... Public humiliation, Doc Henley mused. Might work. Hard for a man to maintain his credibility when his crimes are laid bare for all to see. Clara was already gathering the survey materials, her green eyes bright with renewed determination. What about Rose? We can't let her take the blame for Whitfield's crimes. We won't, Wade promised. When we expose Whitfield's conspiracy, Rose's actions will look like heroism, not criminal behavior. Doc Henley handed Wade the journal, his weathered hands steady despite his age. This is 20 years of trust from my patients. Don't waste it. We won't, Wade said, the weight of responsibility settling on his shoulders like a familiar coat. As they prepared to leave, Clara caught Wade's arm. Are you sure about this? If we're wrong, if Judge Cross doesn't believe us, then we'll face the consequences together, Wade replied. But Clara, I'm done running from fights that matter. Whether we win or lose tomorrow, we'll know we stood up when it counted. She nodded, her grip tightening on her father's compass. Outside, the wind carried the scent of approaching weather. Snow, maybe, or the first hint of spring. Either way, tomorrow would bring change. The only question was what kind. Court convened at 10 o'clock sharp in the hotel's main dining room, the only space in Stone Creek large enough to hold the crowd. Judge Cross sat behind a makeshift bench constructed from dining tables, his black robes lending gravity to the improvised courtroom. The smell of coffee and bacon still lingered in the air, mixing with the scent of nervous sweat and anticipation. Wade and Clara sat in the front row, her father's survey materials spread between them like weapons prepared for battle. Behind them, the room buzzed with whispered conversations as half the town craned their necks to see the proceedings. Marcus Whitfield entered with 2 lawyers from Billings, their expensive suits and polished shoes marking them as outsiders in this frontier town. Whitfield's confidence filled the room like smoke, thick and choking. Your Honor, the lead lawyer began, his voice smooth as snake oil, we're here to resolve the matter of fraudulent land claims and criminal conspiracies by the defendants, Wade Garrett and Clara Morrison. Judge Cross consulted his papers, his steel-gray eyes moving between the parties. Mr. Garrett, you stand accused of harboring a fugitive in conspiracy to defraud the territorial government. Miss Morrison, you're accused of abandoning legal obligations and aiding in document forgery. How do you plead? Wade stood, his legs steady despite the magnitude of the moment. Not guilty, Your Honor, and we've got evidence to prove it. Whitfield's lawyer smirked. Your Honor, the defendants have already shown their willingness to fabricate evidence. Yesterday's theft of telegraph communications. Wasn't theft, Wade interrupted. It was investigation. And what Miss Chin discovered proves Marcus Whitfield has been defrauding the territorial government for months. Judge Cross leaned forward, interested despite himself. That's a serious accusation, Mr. Garrett. I hope you can back it up. Clara stood beside Wade, her father's compass gleaming in the morning light streaming through the windows. We can, Your Honor, with documented proof of the original territorial survey and evidence of systematic fraud. She placed the brass marker rubbings on the judge's table, their green patina speaking of age and authenticity. These are from iron survey stakes placed by my father in 1864, 15 years before Mr. Whitfield's first railroad claims. They established the legal boundaries of every homestead in this valley. Whitfield's face had gone pale, but his lawyer pressed forward. Your Honor, even if such markers exist, they don't invalidate properly filed railroad acquisition papers. They do if the railroad papers are fraudulent, Doc Henley said, rising from his seat in the gallery. He moved forward with surprising spryness for his age, carrying his leather journal like a sacred text. Judge Cross frowned. Dr. Henley, this is highly irregular. So is conspiracy to defraud honest settlers, Doc replied firmly. Your Honor, I've been documenting suspicious activities in this town for months. Conversations overheard in my clinic, payment schedules discussed by Whitfield's men, evidence of forged documents and false testimony. He placed the journal on the judge's table, its pages filled with careful notations. Everything's documented, dates, times, witnesses, including Whitfield's admission that he paid for false testimony about Miss Morrison's character. The room erupted in angry murmurs. Judge Cross banged his makeshift gavel, a carpenter's hammer, for order. Furthermore, Clara continued, her voice cutting through the noise. The survey coordinates prove Mr. Whitfield filed claims on land he knew was already legally owned. That's not civil fraud, Your Honor. That's criminal conspiracy. Whitfield finally found his voice. These are lies. Desperate fabrications by criminals trying to avoid justice. Then explain this, Wade said, pulling out one of Rose's intercepted telegrams. Message sent from you to the railroad office 3 weeks before Clara arrived. Land acquisition proceeding on schedule. Homestead challenges filed. Resistance minimal. Judge Cross read the telegram, his expression growing darker. Mr. Whitfield, this suggests you were planning to challenge legitimate homestead claims before any supposed abandonment by Miss Morrison. That's taken out of context. Context like this? Clara interrupted, producing another telegram. Your message to a Billings law firm. Require legal representation, territorial court, multiple homestead disputes, substantial railroad compensation authorized. The judge's face was thunderous now. Mr. Whitfield, these communications indicate premeditated fraud against the territorial government. That's a federal crime. Whitfield's composure cracked completely. You don't understand the pressures I was under. The railroad demanded results, threatened to ruin me if I didn't deliver land acquisitions on schedule. His lawyer grabbed his arm, trying to silence him, but Whitfield shook him off. I never meant for anyone to get hurt. The bride scheme was just supposed to provide cover, make the claims look legitimate. His voice rose to a near shout. How was I supposed to know she'd survive that blizzard? The courtroom fell silent except for the sound of Judge Cross's pen scratching across paper. When he looked up, his eyes held the weight of absolute authority. Marcus Whitfield, you are under arrest for conspiracy to defraud the territorial government, filing false land claims, and attempted murder. He nodded to Sheriff Burns. Take him into custody. As the handcuffs clicked around Whitfield's wrists, Judge Cross turned to Wade and Clara. All charges against you are dismissed. Furthermore, I'm ordering a full review of every land transaction in this district over the past year. The room exploded in cheers and applause. Wade felt Clara's hand slip into his, her fingers warm despite the morning cold. Rose? Clara asked. Will be released immediately with a formal apology from the territory, Judge Cross replied. Her actions helped expose a significant criminal conspiracy. As they walked out of the makeshift courtroom into the bright Montana morning, Clara consulted her father's compass one last time. The needle pointed steadily north toward the high country where truth had been buried under snow and lies. What now? Wade asked. Clara smiled, the first genuine smile he'd seen from her since that night in the blizzard. Now we build something worth having, together. 5 months later, spring came to the Montana Territory like a promise kept. Wade stood on the porch of their expanded cabin, watching Clara tend the garden she'd planted where the snow had finally melted. The smell of rich earth and new growth filled the air, replacing winter's bite with the soft warmth of possibility. Her father's compass sat on the windowsill inside, its needle pointing steadily north toward the high country where iron stakes still marked the boundaries of honest claims. Rose Chin had returned to her telegraph key, but now she sent messages that carried truth instead of intercepted lies. Doc Henley continued his rounds, his journal recording the ordinary dramas of birth and healing instead of conspiracy and fraud. Marcus Whitfield served his sentence in territorial prison, a cautionary tale about the price of choosing greed over honesty. The railroad had sent new agents, men who understood that legitimate business was built on fair dealing, not forged papers and abandoned brides. The valley prospered under honest stewardship, homesteaders working land they truly owned. Clara looked up from her planting, soil dark under her fingernails, her face bright with the contentment of work worth doing. Supper in an hour, she called. Wade nodded, breathing in the scent of her cooking that would soon fill their home. Some evenings, when the wind was right, he could still hear the ghost of that winter storm that had brought Clara to his door, but it no longer sounded like a howling threat. Now it sounded like the voice of Providence, reminding him that the best things in life often came disguised as the worst. A man could spend his whole life running from storms, or he could learn to open his door when someone knocked, trust his compass to point toward true north, and build something lasting from the wreckage of other people's lives. The choice, as always, was his to make.